is anywhere between 2039 and 627 BC, not 2250 BC as Zeitgeist claims. Brian Lewis's The Sargon Legend, published from the American Schools of Oriental Research, said that the Sargon story lacks any obvious grammatical, lexicographical, or philological feature that would allow a precise dating. Lewis offers the suggestion that the story was written in the reign of Sargon II, a much later king who was possibly a usurper, to legitimate his own rule. In favor of a late date of the Sargon story are Neo-Assyrian orthographic forms, idiomatic expressions attested only in a later period, and the mention of cutting roads with bronze or copper picks. In any event, there is no satisfactory reason to propose borrowing or fictionalization in either direction.
Moses is known as the lawgiver, the giver of the Ten Commandments, the Mosaic Law. However, the idea of a law being passed from God to a prophet up on a mountain is also a very old motif. Moses is just another lawgiver in a long line of lawgivers in mythological history. In India, Manu was the great lawgiver. In Crete, Minos ascended Mount Dicta, where Zeus gave him the sacred laws, while in Egypt there was Meses, who carried stone tablets and upon them the laws of God were written.
Acharya S. is our source that notes the similarities between Moses, Manu, Minos, and Meses. As usual, these claims cannot be supported by credible or primary sources. Acharya's source is Deceptions and Myths of the Bible by Lloyd Graham, published in 1991. This book is also a terrible reference which has no original source material. Even skeptic author Michael Lido, who originally used Graham's book, agrees. Graham's Deceptions and Myths of the Bible, I will concede, is a terrible source. Once I discovered how bad the source was, I had to edit the book prior to publishing. Regarding the Meses and Moses connection, the skeptic author Michael Lido says, I will not argue the Meses story. I do not like it myself.
And as far as the Ten Commandments, they are taken outright from spell 125 in the Egyptian Book of the Dead.
Spell 125, the earliest collection, dates from 1580 to 1350 BC. It is therefore reasonable to suggest that the Ten Commandments predate spell 125, given that the Pentateuch has been dated to belong to approximately 1400 BC. However, plagiarism cannot be proven in either direction. Perhaps it would be more relevant to note the major differences between the two. The Ten Commandments represent a concise, positive instruction from God to man and the life he should lead. Spell 125 represents a countless disarray of negative protests by the already dead. Throughout history, ancient civilizations have defined right and wrong, good and evil. Nevertheless, all modern and ancient societies have maintained some standard of law or code of which there is much overlap and similarities between variations throughout history. As the Apostle Paul wrote, For when the Gentiles which do not have the law do by nature the things contained in the law, these, not having the law, are a law to themselves, which show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts the meanwhile accusing or else excusing one another.
Justin Martyr, one of the first Christian historians and defenders, as far as he was concerned, the devil did it. The devil had the foresight to come before Christ and create his characteristics in the pagan world.
Justin Martyr, the early Christian defender, was raised in a pagan home and was familiar with Greek philosophy. All these passages suggest that Justin Martyr is simply attempting to convince skeptical pagan audiences by parallels that would be familiar and communicable to them. He was also attempting to convince the Roman emperor that Christian teachings and claims were not that different from other religions that enjoyed Rome's protection, while Christians were being persecuted and killed for their beliefs. J. Gresham Machen, a New Testament professor at Princeton Theological Seminary, stated, When Justin Martyr refers to the birth of Perseus as a birth from or through a virgin, he is going beyond what the pagan sources contained. There seems to be no clear evidence that pagan sources used the word virgin as referring to mothers of heroes, mythical or historical, who were represented as being begotten by the gods. Zeitgeist claims that the devil had the foresight to come before Christ and create these characteristics in the pagan world is yet another obvious misinterpretation of the text. Justin Martyr wrote, From what has been already said, you can understand how the devils, in imitation of what was said by Moses, asserted that Proserpine was the daughter of Jupiter, and instigated the people to set up an image of her under the name of Korah. For as we wrote above, Moses said, "In the beginning God made the heaven and the earth was without form and unfurnished, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters." In imitation, therefore, of what is here said of the Spirit of God moving on the waters, they said that Proserpine, or Coral, was the daughter of Jupiter, and in like manner also they craftily feigned that Minerva was the daughter of Jupiter, not by sexual union, but, knowing that God conceived and made the world by the Word, they say that Minerva is the first conception, which we consider to be very absurd, bringing forward the form of the conception in a female shape. Hence, Justin did not argue that demons or the devil copied Christian beliefs beforehand, as Zeitgeist claims. Rather, they copied the older Jewish beliefs and prophecies about Jesus found in the Old Testament. In another place, Justin says, "And these things were said both among the Greeks and among all nations, where they, the demons, heard the prophets foretelling that Christ would specially be believed in, but that in hearing what was said by the prophets, they did not accurately understand it, but imitated what was said of our Christ. Like men who are in error, we will make plain." If Zeitgeist wants to cite Justin Martyr as an historical reference, it cannot be denied that Justin knew these parallels were hardly parallels at all, because he affirms that the greatest distinction of Jesus, his crucifixion, was not copied by the pagan myths, as Zeitgeist alleges. He said, "But in no instance, not even in any of those called sons of Jupiter, Zeus, did they imitate the being crucified, for it was not understood by them, all the things said of it having been put symbolically." Justin also notes that no proof is offered for the Greek gods, because they were mythical, but Jesus was a historical person. He says, "But those who hand down the myths which the poets have made, adduce no proof to the youths who learn them, and we proceed to demonstrate that they have been uttered by the influence of the wicked demons, to deceive and lead astray the human race."
Furthermore, is there any non-biblical historical evidence of any person living with the name Jesus, the Son of Mary, who traveled about with 12 followers, healing people and the like? There are numerous historians who lived in and around the Mediterranean, either during or soon after the assumed life of Jesus. How many of these historians document this figure? Not one. However, to be fair, that doesn't mean defenders of the historical Jesus haven't claimed the contrary. 4 historians are typically referenced to justify Jesus' existence. Pliny the Younger, Suetonius, and Tacitus are the first 3.
Unlike these mythical deities, the documentation for a historical Jesus is actually more compelling than the documentation for other ancient figures like Confucius and Buddha. Peter Joseph makes several false statements here. First of all, none of these historians mentioned were defenders of the historical Jesus. They were secular or non-Christian sources. In consideration of the lack of attention paid by the ancient Greco-Roman world to the humble beginnings of Christianity and Jesus being a Jewish figure in a remote location on the eastern frontier of the Roman Empire, and was therefore of little interest to the Roman historians writing Roman literature, there is a considerable amount of historical evidence that confirms his existence. There are not just 4 historical references for Jesus' existence, as Zeitgeist boldly alleges, but in fact, 42 authors mention Jesus within 150 years of his life. On the contrary, only 10 authors mention Tiberius Caesar, the Roman emperor during Jesus' ministry within 150 years of his life. If liberal scholars applied the same arbitrary standard of rejection of historical evidence to other ancient historical personages besides Jesus, such as Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great, they would be forced to reject all history as myth. It is for this reason the brilliant historian F.F. Bruce wrote, "The historicity of Christ is as axiomatic for an unbiased historian as the historicity of Julius Caesar." Tacitus was governor of Asia in AD 112 and was known as the greatest historian of ancient Rome. In his Annals of Imperial Rome, Tacitus wrote about Emperor Nero's persecution of the Christians. He says, To suppress, therefore, the common rumor, Nero procured others to be accused, and inflicted exquisite punishments upon those people who were in abhorrence for their crimes, and were commonly known as Christians. They had their denomination from Christus, Christ, who in the reign of Tiberius was put to death as a criminal by the procurator Pontius Pilate. This pernicious superstition, though checked for a while, broke out again and spread not only over Judea, the source of this evil, but reached the city Rome also.
Each one of their entries consists of only a few sentences at best, and only referred to Christus or the Christ, which in fact is not a name but a title. It means the Anointed One.
Zeitgeist disregards Tacitus's reference to Jesus based on the title Christus. But how many Christs were there who were crucified under Pontius Pilate? This witness directly corresponds to the gospel record of Jesus. Christus was Greek for Christ. These historical accounts do not only refer to Christ, as Zeitgeist alleges, but give us much more information, which also concludes that the Christus in view must be Jesus. For example, such historical documents confirm that Jesus was executed as a criminal under the authority of Pontius Pilate, who ruled Judea and under the reign of Emperor Tiberius. History provides proof that the Christians who began in Judea spread through the Roman Empire and suffered great persecution for their faith, and that these Christians derived their worship and religion from the person known as Christ, or the Messiah. All of these details parallel the gospel accounts, validating that Jesus is in view here. Suetonius was the official historian during the reign of both Emperor Trajan and Adrian. Speaking of the Emperor Claudius, who ruled from AD 41 to 54, he wrote, "He banished the Jews from Rome, who were continually making disturbances, Chrestus being their leader." The name Chrestus is another spelling for the name Christ, or Christus. This statement from Suetonius also confirms the passage in the Bible within the book of Acts chapter 18 about the exiling of the Jews from Rome during the reign of Claudius. Suetonius also recounts that punishment by Nero was inflicted on the Christians, a class of men given to a new mischievous superstition. Suetonius confirms that Christians were suffering and dying for their conviction that Jesus had lived, died, and risen from the dead. A mischievous superstition, as he called it, not being a Christian. Pliny the Younger was governor of the Roman provinces of Pontus and Bithynia in AD 101 to 110. In a letter to the emperor, Pliny the Younger requested specific instructions about the interrogations of Christians whom he was persecuting. He said he made them curse Christ, which a genuine Christian cannot be induced to do. He continued, "They affirmed, however, that the whole of their guilt or their error was that they were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verse a hymn to Christ as to a God, and bound themselves to a solemn oath, not to any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, adultery, never to falsify their word, not to deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up." Are we to believe that within 2 generations fake characters were now being treated as historical people?
The fourth source is Josephus, and this source has been proven to be a forgery for hundreds of years. Sadly, it is still cited as truth.
Josephus, the Jewish historian, is known for historical works such as Jewish Antiquities, finished in AD 93 or 94. One passage reads, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the 3rd day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct at this day." This is the passage that has raised heated debate among scholars because Josephus, a non-Christian Jew, makes statements about Jesus that an Orthodox Jew would not normally affirm. While some Christian additions may have been obviously foreign to the text, it still contains a great deal of historical truth that Josephus could have easily documented. In fact, the vast majority of scholars do not dismiss the account as a forgery, as Zeitgeist alleges, but believe that Josephus did mention Jesus in this passage, but later insertions were made by a Christian scribe, hence the statements about Jesus that a non-Christian like Josephus wouldn't have made. But the style of Josephus is authentic. The term wise man, for example, is typical for Josephus's writings. Zeitgeist's accusation that this text is a forgery is an exaggeration. Moreover, there is another reference to Jesus in Josephus's work that is not disputed by scholars, proving that Jesus was an historical figure. He says, "But the younger Ananus, who, as we said, received the high priesthood, was of bold disposition and exceptionally daring. He followed the party of the Sadducees, who are severe in judgment above all the Jews, as we have already shown. As therefore Ananus was of such a disposition, he thought he had now a good opportunity, as Festus was now dead, and Albinus was still on the road. So he assembled a council of judges, and brought before it the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ, whose name was James, together with some others, and having accused them as lawbreakers, he delivered them over to be stoned." So this great first-century non-biblical historian Josephus, writing just a little more than 50 years after Jesus' life and crucifixion, attests that Jesus had a brother named James, and was a real historical figure.
You would think that a guy who rose from the dead and ascended into heaven for all eyes to see, and performed the wealth of miracles acclaimed to him, would have made it into the historical record. It didn't, because once the evidence is weighed, there are very high odds that the figure known as Jesus did not even exist.
Again, there are not only 4 historical sources for Jesus' existence as Zeitgeist boldly claims, but 42 authors mention Jesus within 150 years of his life. We don't have time to quote them all. Expert on world religions, ancient Christianity, and church history, Robert E. Van Voorst says, "The theory of Jesus' non-existence remains effectively dead as a scholarly question." Again, Zeitgeist misinterprets the Bible, saying Jesus ascended into heaven for all eyes to see. The book of Acts chapter 1 describes Jesus' ascension in front of a very small group of people. To disregard or disbelieve his miracles and resurrection is one thing, but to claim that he never existed in the face of all the evidence is a premise rejected by even non-Christian historians and scholars. Richard Burridge and Graham Gould state that the questioning of Jesus' existence is not accepted by mainstream critical scholarship. Robert Van Voorst has stated, "The non-historicity thesis has always been controversial, and it has consistently failed to convince scholars of many disciplines and religious creeds. Biblical scholars and classical historians now regard it as effectively refuted."
It was the political establishment that sought to historize the Jesus figure for social control. By 325 AD in Rome, Emperor Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea. It was during this meeting that the politically motivated Christian doctrines were established, and thus began a long history of Christian bloodshed and spiritual fraud. And for the next 1600 years, the Vatican maintained a political stranglehold on all of Europe, leading to such joyous periods as the Dark Ages, along with enlightening events such as the Crusades and the Inquisition.
Regarding Constantine, Dr. Ben Witherington III writes, "What then did Emperor Constantine have to do with all of this process? Constantine ruled as Roman Emperor from about AD 313 to 337. The truth of the matter is that he didn't take full control of the empire before 324, or very shortly before the Council of Nicaea. This fact alone should make evident that most theological issues, including those about Christ's nature, had taken a rather definite shape and trajectory before Constantine had anything to do with them. At the Council of Nicaea, Constantine seems to have favored Christ's true divinity, but he was no theologian, and it certainly wasn't he who wrote the Creed of Nicaea, nor can it be said that he determined the canon. Constantine mainly pronounced the benediction on the deliberations that had already been formulated. Zeitgeist is correct about the Roman Catholic Church's long history of bloodshed throughout the Dark Ages, the Crusades, and the Inquisition. However, these facts do not negate the credibility of Christianity, but rather demonstrate the sinfulness of man. Regardless of how later professing Christians behaved, Jesus taught his followers to love all people, including their enemies, and to remain peaceful with all people at all costs. Violence, bloodshed, and spiritual fraud in the name of Jesus does not come from the Bible, nor does the New Testament condone such events. but it came from the Roman Catholic Church. It was also the Roman Catholic Church that embraced pagan sun god worship. Anybody who reads the New Testament for themselves will see that violent Christians live contrary to what the Bible teaches and are therefore not followers of Jesus at all. As presented earlier, there are numerous non-biblical historians who speak of Jesus. Thus it was not the political establishment that sought to historize Jesus. This is not to say that the Bible has not been perverted and taken out of context by the political elite for social control throughout history and even today. In the secret FEMA plan to use pastors as pacifiers in preparation for martial law, this debriefing tells pastors to help implement FEMA and Homeland Security directives. FEMA directors told pastors to preach specific passages to their congregations like Romans 13, the Bible passage often taken out of context by dictators like Hitler to hoodwink Christians into supporting him. While the Bible teaches in Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2 that God has given law enforcement officials of worldly governments the right to enforce penalties of crimes and to go to war against other nations, this is not a Christian duty. The Bible does not teach Christians blind submission to authority, but in many cases to resist the ordained powers in order to obey what God has commanded. If the state's orders are in conflict to Jesus' teachings, including murder, war, idolatry, etc., then resistance to those powers is obedience to God. Zeitgeist's argument is invalid because there are several examples of civil disobedience in the Bible. For example, Daniel chapter 3 documents a few of the Hebrews' unwillingness to compromise the commandments of God in submission to the Babylonian Empire. Exodus chapter 1 speaks of the Hebrew midwives who refused to obey the Egyptian Empire's commands to kill male babies, and Joshua chapter 2 documents the harlot Rahab who housed the Hebrew spies and hid them from the authorities. The book of Acts is full of examples of how the apostles of the early Christian church disobeyed the Jewish authorities in order to preach the gospel. Peter taught to obey God rather than men. Though the Christ myth theory, also known as the Jesus myth, is not original, it is very recent, historically speaking. The antecedents of the theory can be traced directly back to French Enlightenment thinkers Constantin François Volney and Charles François Dupuy in the 1790s. Proponents and authors cited in the Zeitgeist transcript have recently repopularized the theory. The questioning of Jesus' existence is not accepted by mainstream scholarship as stated by Richard Burridge and Graham Gould in their book Jesus Now and Then, page 34. Michael Grant states on page 199 of his book Jesus and Historians' Review of the Gospels that the Jesus myth thesis fails to satisfy modern critical methodology and is rejected by all but a few scholars. Graham N. Stanton writes, "Today nearly all historians, whether Christians or not, accept that Jesus existed and that the Gospels contain plenty of valuable evidence which has to be weighed and assessed critically. There is general agreement that with the possible exception of Paul, we know far more about Jesus of Nazareth than about any 1st or 2nd century Jewish or pagan religious teacher." James Charlesworth sums it up. "No reputable scholar today questions that a Jew named Jesus, son of Joseph, lived. Most readily admit that we know a considerable amount about his actions and basic teachings." Jonathan Z. Smith, who contributed to the entry Dying and Rising Gods for the Encyclopedia of Religion, said, "The category of dying and rising gods, once a major topic of scholarly investigation, must now be understood to have been largely a misnomer based on imaginative reconstructions and exceedingly late or highly ambiguous texts. The category of dying and rising deities is exceedingly dubious. It has been based largely on Christian interest and tenuous evidence. As such, the category is of more interest to the history of scholarship than to the history of religions." Even liberal scholar Thomas Bosslooper acknowledges, "Contemporary writers invariably use only secondary sources to verify such claims. The scholars whose judgment they accept rarely produced or quoted the primary sources." Yet Zeitgeist and its sources continue to propagate this theory in spite of all the evidence. In part 1 of the film Zeitgeist, nearly 200 sources are cited in the transcript. Yet many of these sources are used more than once, and none of them predate Christianity. For example, D.M. Murdoch, who also goes by the pen name Acharya S., is cited 29 times, and Gerald Massey is cited 30 times. The Bible is cited 22 times, almost always with erroneous conclusions. In fact, when the transcript for this film is examined in further detail, we see that less than 25% of these sources are original. Like the French Enlightenment thinkers, Sir James Frazer, cited 4 times in Zeitgeist, wrote The Golden Bough in 1890 when these mystery religions were still mysteries. It is from his work and others that Gerald Massey and Acharya S. get much of their information. However, Frazer's pioneering work has come under criticism by more recent scholars. When the newly accumulated archaeological and textual evidence is consulted, his ideas are no longer valid. Professor of History at Miami University Dr. Edwin Yamauchi stated, "On the popular level, Sir James Frazer gathered a mass of parallels in his multi-volume work called The Golden Bough, which was published in 1906. He discussed Osiris of Egypt, Adonis of Syria, Attis of Asia Minor, and Tammuz of Mesopotamia, and concluded that there was a common rising and dying fertility god. Unfortunately, much of his work was based on a misreading of evidence." In 1970, John Allegro, another of Zeitgeist sources, wrote a book entitled The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. He proposes that the earliest Christians were actually a secret cult group that used hallucinogenic mushrooms and utilized the name Jesus as a code word to avoid letting outsiders know about their secret activities. Allegro was criticized immediately by almost every major historical scholar. The Times newspaper of London printed a letter signed by 15 scholars in the Semitic languages who dismissed his conclusions, stating that it was not based on any philological or other evidence that they can regard as scholarly. And what about this amulet of Dionysus as a crucified figure pictured and dated 500 BC in Zeitgeist? Timothy Freak and Peter Gandy, cited 7 times in the film, feature a picture of the amulet on the cover of their book, The Jesus Mysteries. The Zeitgeist claim that this amulet dates back to 500 BC is a lie. Actually, the amulet dates centuries after the 1st century AD, after the establishment of Christianity. One researcher, James Hannum, documented, "Although it features on the cover of the Jesus Mysteries, Timothy Freak and Peter Gandy are actually quite circumspect about the amulet in the text. I emailed them to ask in which book they had found it. Peter Gandy kindly replied that it was in the 2nd edition of Guthrie's Orpheus and the Greek Religion, as well as R. Eisler's Orpheus the Fisher, first published in 1920. Oddly enough, it isn't in the appendix of either of these books. On my next visit to London, I looked both these books up at the Warburg Institute and found the note in Guthrie's work that the amulet was believed to be a fake. In subsequent email correspondence through an intermediary, Peter Gandy eventually came clean. I will quote in full. "I have to admit that James Hannum is correct. Kern's comment is indeed in Guthrie's book. In sum, not only is the amulet shown in the film Zeitgeist and on the cover of the Jesus Mysteries a fake, but at least one author of the book knew it was a fake and kept quiet about it until now. This displays the dishonesty of Zeitgeist's Freak and Gandy, discrediting their researching abilities."
First, let me say something about Freak and Gandy's book. I do not recommend that book. I would prefer that no one ever read it. It's only marginally better than Percy Graves' work. Their research is on key parts, it's shoddy, and their source citations minimal, problematic. There's no way to know when they've gotten something right or wrong without redoing all their research, which makes their book useless. And that's the same complaint I had against Graves' book. To figure out what's in there that's even correct, you have to completely redo the whole work, and why even read the book if you're just going to do all the work yourself anyway.
Edward Carpenter is cited 8 times, but is hardly a qualified expert in our current inquiry, but was a socialist poet, philosopher, and early gay activist in the late 1800s. Thomas Doane is cited 19 times in Zeitgeist for his work Bible Myths and Parallels in Other Religions. One researcher responds, in chapter 28, page 282 of Doane's book, he asserts the things you mention about the parallels between Jesus and Krishna, or Krishna, as he spells it. He gives the appearance of documenting his assertions about Krishna being crucified and resurrected, for example, in extensive footnotes. But when you check out the footnotes, each one refers not to an original document for its basis, but to another chapter in the same book. In the case of the critical for Christian's assertion, The Resurrection, chapter 23, he then documents his statements about Krishna on page 215 in yet another footnote.